We will reconvene the meeting. And I am going to turn over the floor to Regent Albrecht, who is chair of our Administrative Budget and Audit Oversight Committee. Regent Albrecht.
Thank you, Chair Tuss. This is an opportunity to convene the Administrative Budget and Audit Oversight Committee. And I would like to begin with the information part of our agenda and invite Deputy Commissioner Tyler Trevor to come forward to talk about performance funding allocation model update.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, thank you. It is my distinct honor to introduce Dr. Bob Makwa from MSU and Dr. Tony Crawford from U of M. They will be handling the presentation.
I can't believe he's getting off that easy. So hi, my name is Bob Makwa. I'm a faculty member at Montana State University. My area of teaching is in civil engineering, and I've been involved with this committee almost exactly 2 years we started. And so today what we're going to do is provide a very brief overview. Let me see. Provide a very brief overview of how we got to this point, how we got to today. We'll talk about the process, which is probably the most important component of our discussion here today. And we're going from this phase 1 to a phase 2 model. And we'll talk about the details of the allocation model. So joining me today is Tony Crawford from the University of Montana, and he will provide us some input on that. And then we'll summarize things and address questions. I'd encourage you, if you have questions as we go, to please ask them. Our role here is twofold today. We want to provide you an update, but we also want to get input. And so we'd like to hear from you as well. And so if we start back and dial back 2 years ago to March 2013, Commissioner Christian earlier mentioned the nice working relationship that the Commissioner's office has with the Governor's office. And so 2 years ago, 2 years ago, this tripartite agreement was established in terms of relating this tuition freeze, the MUS budget request, and then here's where our performance funding process was born, with the agreement that the state would enter into a performance funding allocation approach for appropriating state funds. So at that time, a committee was formed, a working group was quickly formed because time was of the essence. At the next board meeting in May, the committee presented an allocation model with some metrics to the board for approval. And so Tyler, Deputy Commissioner Trevor, was our leader, and we moved forward rather quickly. The outcomes at that time were measured in fiscal year 2014 and funds distributed this year in 2015. And so about $7.5 million were appropriated from the state allocation for performance funding, and that's been distributed to our campuses now. The phase 1 model consisted of 2 metrics. And those were metrics that were selected because they were outcomes that the universities and colleges in the state were already working on, right? Because the data had already been completed by the time the model was finalized. And these outcomes also fit in with the state's goal of increasing the percentage of Montana students with a higher education credential. So after the approval in May of our short-term phase 1 model, which also could be considered, I think of it as a pilot model, the committee jumped in and started developing what we call the long-term model. And I'm referring to them now as phase 1 and phase 2 models. But the committee immediately got to work on a long-term model. The committee membership was expanded to include representatives from across the state, and also the vertically and horizontal membership. In other words, we had members from students, faculty, deans, academic leaders, planning and analysis, institutional research, budgeting. And so we had a good mix on this team. Our initial focus was to obtain broader engagement with the community. We wanted feedback. We wanted to take our time and do it right. We wanted to hear what the concerns were and to get the good ideas, and also to look at best practices. Our ultimate goal was to develop this long-term allocation model that we're here today to talk about. So as we move forward, February last month, there were discussions continued, very similar to what happened 2 years ago, in terms of this planning between the Commissioner's office and the Governor's office. We've heard a bit about that already today, the concept of freezing tuition, our MUS budget request, and with the idea that we would continue with performance funding. And so that's what the committee has had in mind, and that's what we've continued to work on for the last 2 years. And so we're here today to provide you an update on where we're at with this long-term Phase 2 model. So the process, and again, the process is I think, is the key to what we're doing here. We expanded the committee membership. It's truly a shared governance type of operation. Tyler has done an excellent job of keeping us out of the ditches. And in the process, we've divided into smaller working groups to address specifics. So this is where our steering committee began. And you can see there is a good mix of individuals from our different campuses. But this list is not complete. There were a lot of others that pitched in. You know, Tony, for example, with his expertise. I saw Grace Anderson here earlier from Great Falls College. She provided a lot of good input from the institutional research basis, and many others from our campus. In fact, we had a lot of input from all levels in terms of ideas, concepts, questions that helped us along the way. In fact, one of the questions, I think about a year ago, we've met nearly every Friday for the last 2 years. And about a year ago, someone asked Tyler, how long are we going to be on this committee? And I think he said, until you die. And so I think he was kidding. And so as we moved along in the process, there was a lot of listening and learning and listening some more. We had a lot of listening sessions. We had forums. We had charrettes. We visited with faculty senates, governance councils. We reached out and got as much input as we could. We wanted to make this transparent. We had a lot of great ideas. We researched best practices. You know, this was, at one level, quite fun as a faculty member. I mean, this is what we do, right? We do our scholarly research, we find out what others are doing, and then we try to improve on that. And that's what we've tried to do here. And then lastly, we developed some metrics, and I'll show you those metrics, but you've seen them before. Those that were previously approved here. And then we developed this model, this allocation model that we'll talk a little about. So here are the metrics that were approved back in the May board meeting. They're divided into 3 sectors. Our institutions are grouped for this purpose in doctoral, 4-year, and 2-year. Doctoral campuses have 4 metrics. 4-year campuses, 2 metrics. And then the 2-year campuses all have the 3 similar metrics plus a menu where they select 2 additional metrics. So we don't plan on going into any detail about the metrics today, other than to say that our model is now being built around these metrics that the Regents approved. And so we had some guiding principles in developing those metrics, but we also, based on the input that we received from our campuses, put together some important attributes. You know, through these charrettes and forums, we heard a lot of very good ideas, and we tried to boil them down to 6 things that we could use to help us, guide us in developing the allocation model. So reward progress and improvement overall. You know, that's really what performance funding models are about. So the model, we recognize, has to have some aspect of measuring and rewarding progress and improvement on our campuses. And of course, we're doing that at an institutional level. We want to avoid competition between institutions. You know, at some level, competition certainly is good, whether it's in business or athletics, and it's probably good for our campuses at some level. But it gets to a point where that could be detrimental to reaching common goals for the university system. So we didn't want campuses competing against each other using our students sort of as the playing field. So we wanted to avoid competition between campuses. By doing that, we have a fixed amount of money that would be allocated to performance funding. Without the competitive aspect, we're going to probably have money left over. Most likely, every campus won't meet the target. So what do we do with that money that's left over? And we call that a residual. We'll talk more about that. We also recognize that some of the aspects, some of the things in these metrics are out of our control. No matter what we do, there's economic things, other environmental concerns that affect the outcomes. So there's noise in the data. And we wanted to have a way of smoothing out, filtering out some of that noise based on past performance. So the model should have that. We certainly want to account for underrepresented at-risk populations. That was discussed in our previous May meeting. And so we have a component, a bonus weighting system for 4 groups: veterans, Native Americans, Pell recipients, and non-traditional age students. And lastly, we want to reinforce the importance of academic quality. We heard this over and over again, and it's certainly a point that we've kept in mind from the beginning. And in fact, when we talk about quality, I'm just going to dial us up to the highest level. This comes from the MUS Systems Strategic Plan. I think everyone in here is on board with the concept of quality. I imagine, like you, probably many of you have this taped on your bathroom mirror. Maybe not. But maintaining the high quality of our institutions is the most important consideration for every goal and initiative of the Montana University system. So I think we all get that, right? From the system level on down. Quality is important. We don't want to do anything here that could possibly impact quality. And if we do, we need to recalibrate, right? I think impacting the quality would be a bad outcome of this. I think it would move us into that category of a bad state versus a good state that we heard a little bit about before. So we're sensitive to that. All of our institutions strive to deliver the highest quality. If you would go through and look at the mission statements or the visions or the values of all of our Montana campuses, you'd see this language about quality and excellence. So we know it's important. Ultimately, I feel very strongly that faculty are the gatekeepers of academic quality. You know, there's an integrity issue, and faculty feel very personal about this, and we hear it over and over. So that's important. It's important to all of our campuses. I'll come back to quality in a little bit. Another thing about quality that, well, from a philosophical standpoint, maybe backing up, from a philosophical standpoint, I think we've got the quality thing under control in terms of a number of measures. One, these metrics are based on a institutional level. We're looking at outputs of institutions. And whenever I have the opportunity, I remind faculty that we're not evaluating. The purpose of performance funding is not to evaluate what you're doing in the classroom. It's just to make sure that we keep our eye on the ball. A good example is if you look at our retention rates. You know, at the MSU campus, 20 to 25% of our students aren't retained. We don't see them coming back the sophomore year. So is that because of academic issues? Well, the data says not necessarily. About a third of those students that aren't retained have poor academic grades. You know, they've received warnings, they're on probation, or what have you. So the majority of those students that don't come back, it's not because grades. If we change grades from a D to a C minus, we're not going to see an influx or an increase in our retention. It's other things. You know, there's 18-year-olds. There's a lot going on in their minds. There's a lot going on in their lives. There's things that we could possibly help with, and that's where initiatives in our student affairs and student success divisions have been helping a lot. And so there's a lot of value put into looking at why students aren't retained, why students don't complete. But what we're finding more and more so, it's not necessarily the academic end. And in fact, if we would, as some are afraid, afraid of this concept of dumbing down our classes or lowering our standards, most likely that would have a negative impact on all of these metrics. Maybe a bump upwards in the short term, but in the long term, I think decreasing academic quality would impact all of our institutions in a negative way, and it would show up as a drop in even these performance funding metrics. So from a pragmatic standpoint, we've also developed a list of quality assurance metrics. And at the Montana State campus, we have a specific list of about a dozen metrics that we're tracking in conjunction in parallel with the performance funding metrics. There's no funding associated with these metrics. They don't necessarily meet all the qualifications for metrics. They may not be independently measurable, but they're sort of our dashboard gauges that we're going to keep an eye on to make sure that there's no unintended consequences. And lastly, we're going to measure and evaluate the results. Right? We're going to keep an eye on these dials, and we're going to make sure that there is no impact to what we feel very strongly about as an important aspect of what our institutions deliver, which is the quality. All right. So now I'm going to turn the mic over to Tony, and he's going to tell us a little bit about the details of the allocation model. Thanks, Tony.
Hello, my name's Tony Crawford. I'm a professor of finance at the University of Montana. I've been there about 20 years now. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you about my participation in this modeling effort. A little bit about my background. I guess, if you want to call me an expert in performance pay, it has more to do with my research early on, where I researched pay for performance in the for-profit business world, particularly banking. So I did a lot on the theory behind and the construction of the appropriate sort of pay structures for businesses. And there's some relation, but there are some really big differences, and I recognize that. So I've learned a lot in the process of trying to understand performance funding at the university level. How did I get involved in this? Or maybe better, how did I get sucked into this? A couple of years ago, or more than a couple of years ago, the Commissioner's office sent out a spreadsheet that illustrated how the Phase 1 funding was going to take place. Well, an Excel file in front of a finance professor, it's kind of a dangerous thing. I opened it up. I played with it for a very long time. It's kind of my adult Legos, I guess. And kind of led me to write a very kind of lengthy letter, hopefully that was taken as constructive criticism, about the Phase 1 model and my thoughts. And as you notice, I'm not on the original task force list. I don't think it had anything to do with my letter or anything. But so I've joined later. I like to sort of say I'm kind of a stealth member, and maybe there's good reasons to be stealth. I'm not so stealth anymore, I guess. But I got asked to come in. As Bob was mentioning, in the whole process of getting faculty feedback on this, I submitted my own feedback early, but then I came in as part of the focus groups and some other discussions, and other faculty reviews and faculty senate discussions. And then I was asked to help at the with the UM task force when we were getting into building models. And so I kind of came in at a point where we were discussing the metrics that were approved last year, but I think my background or my strengths in the committee were in kind of taking those metrics that we've developed and putting them into a model that measures performance so that we can actually have a score, if you want to call it that, that measures every campus on those metrics and the ability to either improve or maintain and perform under those metrics that have been approved. So in the discussion, a lot of discussions came up in focus groups, faculty senate, and other faculty presentations about what the fears were in the model, what the concerns were in the model, and we tried to address those. We've picked a model that allocates fundings, I guess similar to the first Phase 1 model. We take whatever performance funding that's been distributed to the campuses generally, and it gets distributed to each campus. Some of this is still under discussion, I think, but the way we've modeled it so far under a 3-year FTE average. So I know as a spokesman from the University of Montana, I think we're about 29%. I think Bozeman's about 29%. And so the funding gets separated. And one of the big concerns that some of our faculty had was they wanted a model that where campuses competed against themselves. So performance was going to be measured on a campus's ability to improve and maintain its performance levels. Rather than, since we're all part of a Montana University system, rather than all of us competing, even though we're kind of members of the same team at some level, each campus was going to compete against itself. So we built a model where every school is eligible for some portion of that funding. They have to earn that funding, but they're eligible for that some portion. Each school has a similar model, but they're built on the different metrics. Doctoral programs have 4 metrics. 4-year schools have 2 metrics that they chose, and then the 2-year schools have about 5 metrics, I guess, total. Now, one of the problems with scaling or scoring metrics is that some of the metrics are counts, like graduation numbers, undergraduate and graduate degrees. Some are percentages, retention rates. Some are dollar amounts. For at least in the doctoral programs, we have research expenditures as a amount. So how do we blend all of those into a score? And one of the things, so to figure that out, we really delve into, we weren't really trying to totally reinvent the wheel. We looked at what other schools were doing. There's lots of other states that are doing performance-based funding. And we individually and in groups researched different programs. We kind of focused in on 2 that we thought we liked the most as a task force. And I think we focused on a model from Indiana and a model from Nevada. U of M kind of built on the Nevada model. Bozeman built up the Indiana model. And we looked at that as a group as a whole, and I think we kind of leaned at this kind of modified version, a modification of what is being used in Nevada to fund higher education or performance funding. And what we liked about that was it took the metrics and it created a blended score, a single score for each institution. And we liked that, but the way they had it set up, every institution had kind of a different scoring system. So a good score for one institution might be 2,500 points, for another it might be 2,200 points, for another it might be 1,000 points. And while I guess within schools you can evaluate that, it didn't seem particularly transparent to us. Plus the fact that some of our variables were numbers and some were percentages. We wanted a way to kind of combine everything. So we indexed everything to 1,000 points, which sounds more complicated than it is. And if you look at the spreadsheet looks very complicated, but hopefully I think the model is pretty simple. We take basically every metric is scaled to 1,000 points. The 1,000 points is based on a 3-year average. So a 3-year average of undergraduate degrees or certificates or completions, a 3-year average of graduate degrees for some of the schools, a 3-year average of retention rates, 3-year average of research expenditures, which would be a doctoral metric. And so a 1,000 point score would mean you were just equal to the previous 3-year average. So improvement is measured by looking at those metrics to see if they improved. 1,010 would mean you'd had a 1% improvement. 1,100 would mean you had a 10% improvement. And then we weigh each of those metrics according to some weighing scheme, which we're still in discussions with faculty and all of our constituents trying to determine what the appropriate weights are for the different metrics. But you come up with a weighted score that's going to be 1,000 if you basically stayed the same, higher than 1,000, which I think is probably on the next slide. So I'll get to that in a second. Well, I'll jump back and forth, sorry. A 1,000 point score would mean that you've actually stayed the same. Above 1,000 means you improved. Below 1,000 means you've regressed a little bit on that score. So it's a simple score, and every school would be scored on the same thing. So 1,000 at every school would mean you stayed the same. Below 1,000 at a school would mean you did worse than you had the previous 3 years, and above would mean you did better. But it's a blended score, and it's a blended score that provides the opportunity of maybe one of your metrics was lower, you can make up for it by having really good, strong successes in other metrics. Oops, I want to go backwards. There we go, sorry. One of the other aspects that I think that Bob had mentioned a little bit earlier was many of the models, or some of the models we looked at, also included sort of additional metrics or measures for at-risk populations or underrepresented populations, however, and they're defined differently from system to system. And what we developed was a bonus program, which basically looks at, it doesn't pull these populations out, they're still part of the basic metrics, but it looks at these subpopulations separately for bonus purposes, and it looks at whether there were improvements or regressions in those areas. So what it provides is a bonus if a university or a school or college improves on those subpopulation groups or the subgroups that we've identified. And we're using a group that's been identified here by, I think, numbers that we have available at the Commissioner's office. It's similar to some of the populations we've seen at some of the other schools we looked at. So if there's been an improvement in retention rates and graduation rates for those populations in a year versus the 3-year average, that allows an opportunity for a bonus award to be made. In recognition that some of these, that it may take more efforts, funding, and so forth to graduate and retain and help these students, many who are non-traditional students with all kinds of things going on outside, or some that are first-time college students, et cetera. I think that's a fairly, recognizing those and funding that has been, I think, something we've seen in almost every model we've looked at. So the model looks something like this. We have a score, right? And the score, the other issue that came up that was addressed a little bit in phase 1 was we didn't want an all or nothing funding. We wanted to recognize that there's variance in some of these numbers that happens for various reasons. Teaching business in 2009, in 2010, there weren't a lot of job opportunities for students interested maybe in a banking career coming out of finance. And so for some, it was an easy decision to stick around and maybe get a second major and not graduate when they normally could have graduated. And those are things that are kind of variances that we want to account for somehow. And so our funding allocation basically creates a target. That target would be based on some kind of a growth rate. 1,000 points would be kind of status quo, so a growth rate could be applied to that. And for a school to achieve the full portion of the funding that's available to it, it would have to achieve a score equal to that target number. Now, because the funding is a limited pot of funding, there is no extra award for exceeding that number. Because there's just a limited amount of funds out there. We didn't know how to model that. And the feedback was that this is the way that our constituents like the model working. So, but we also created kind of a minimum barrier that accounts for that variance statistically. And what would be a sort of a minimal amount, how much variance could there be that's somewhat random and it's non-controllable? And if we can account for that, maybe we allow for some partial funding. Now, if you get to a certain minimum amount, well, then you've had a really bad year, and chances are that's not a statistical anomaly. It's just there was some poor performance, and you would lose funding. So we've created this range, but it's all based on a very simple 1,000-point scale. 1% growth, for example, would be 1,010, or whatever growth rate you might have as your target. Then there would be a minimum, and that minimum would be based on some statistical measure, standard deviation or something like that. We're still discussing the exact numbers there. That still leaves the potential that some money will be left over from period to period, and we've proposed, or we're proposing, or we're discussing, maybe it's probably a better chance because we're going to bring this as a proposal later on. We're discussing with our constituents a model that allows schools or institutions that did not receive all of their funding during the first biennium of a budget period to potentially re-earn that money the second period if they have exceptional performance. So each period they're going to be evaluated separately. So the second year they could earn all their second biennium funding, but if they achieved higher than what they needed to, or they grew and regained some of what they had maybe failed to meet the previous period, there might be an opportunity to receive that funding back the second biennium. The problem is they can't carry problems from the second biennium forward, so I think what we're proposing right now is that any residual after the second year would be spent on student scholarships or something by the office of the Commissioner's office. Right. Final thing, and one of the things is we're asking that we should be assessing and revising this model every biennium. Right, there could be new improved data metrics that are available to measure performance better in the future. We may find other hidden problems, unintended consequences and things that might show up. So we're asking to review this as well. So I think that's my whole spiel.
Thank you. Any comments from the committee?
I have.
Go ahead. Regent Johnstone.
Well, I'll limit mine. Interesting presentation. Thank you. As somebody who deals with performance-based compensation consistently, I both admire you and sympathize with what you're doing. So, I just have a few questions. One, how much is at stake here? How much money are we talking about? Do we know that yet, Clay, or do we have a sense of what that would be?
Madam Chair, Regent Johnstone, the MOU that we have in place right now would double the amount that we put into performance funding each year, so it'd be moved from 7.5 to 15 million.
Okay. And then, in general, how is this allocated? I mean, is the 15 million already embedded in the budget? And so it's just a question of reducing what has been allocated. And are you reasonably comfortable that there's a sufficient nexus between the people that are influencing the performance and how the pot's going to get allocated? I mean, because in order for it to be effective, I think there's got to be a connection between those who are responsible for the performance and those who bear either the risk or the benefit of their performance. So how do you deal with that?
Well, that's, Madam Chair, Regent Johnstone, that's an excellent question. And
Thank
I
you,
think
Trevor.
it's a part of our, it's a part of our completion
Excuse me
agenda.
just a minute, Trevor. I think that's the 41st excellent question that you've referenced today, but I feel good about it.
I usually say that when I don't know exactly what I'm going to say after I say that question, so it buys
Delay
me a little bit of
tactics.
time. But I would look at it like this. Performance funding is a key component of our completion agenda. It's the first strategy right out of the chute, but it's only one. And so campuses and the system need to employ this as a mechanism to increase interest in these areas, which by applying money to the overall scheme of retention and completion certainly has created more interest. And so to be internalized by the presidents, the chancellors, the provosts, it certainly has raised and elevated those topics. Further than that, I don't have much detail to give you. I don't know, Clay, can you help me out there?
That is an excellent question. Well, I think that is at the heart of it, though, is it's really elevated the conversations around what drives those. I think to your point, and I've spent a fair amount of time in the private sector as well, trying to incite people to do what we want to do and meet the goals of the company, and I get that. And I don't know, to be honest, if it's ever going to be as one-to-one direct as maybe you get in a corporate environment or some environment, but I think that it very much is affecting the conversation and the backdrop to those and will have an impact. And I don't think, although it is a large number, it is as large a number as we generally talk about in terms of incentivizing within the corporate structure, whether it's off of base pay or sort of a direct compensation to an individual. It's compensation to an institution, and I think it's having the desired effect, very much so. President Cruzado?
Yes. Mr. Commissioner, members of the board, Regent Johnstone, let me try to take a stab at your question. What we did at Montana State University in our Bozeman campus last May was that we made a call for proposals. We met with the deans met with the department heads, and we said we are going to distribute the $2.1 million that we had received from performance-based funding back to them based on a series of criteria. Some of them were best practices that we already knew that were yielding very positive results. Some of them were, for example, in terms of renovation of some classrooms, uses of some methodologies, of some technologies. The other thing that we knew was that we wanted to reward those departments that were already taking the initiative to make some transformation. But we also wanted to inspire other departments that were not paying close attention. So we had some data where we knew, for example, that there were some bottleneck courses or some long waiting lists for some students that were not having access to some specific sections. So in that sense, we were a little bit more directive, and we said, we're going to give you this money specifically so that more sections of X class can be open during the summer and during the fall. So it was a combination of criteria in which we wanted to reward positive behavior, but also to incent those departments that were not showing us positive results, so that that conversation then really got traction with some monies that were being directed to the classrooms, to the departments, and to the colleges with very specific purposes.
Thank you. And I would just like to thank Dr. Crawford and Dr. Makwa for your investment and your involvement, because certainly you have a lot of other things on your plate. I'm kind of curious how you continue to maintain the engagement across the campuses from folks in this process, and really to maintain that connectedness with the goals here. How do you specifically have a professor realize that retention of their students, individualized, is critical as part of this, for example?
Right. That is a good question. No, thank you, Regent Albright. In the big picture, faculty get the concept of retention and completion. And I think initially when performance funding when this was launched 2 years ago, there frankly was a lot of pushback from faculty. And I think there was a bit of unhappiness from faculty from the standpoint of, well, this is what we do, right? We're hired to educate students. We're hired to get them, to help them to succeed and to get a degree. And so I think part of the pushback was that faculty did get that concept and felt that they were already doing these things. In terms of continuing to engage faculty, I'm gathering you mean in terms of looking for measures to help with these metrics as we move forward.
And how do they have skin in the game? Why should they care? I mean, how do they keep their eye on the goal?
Well, I think that's sort of connected to what faculty do in terms of being successful in the classroom, being successful in the labs.
Because you folks who are involved are focused on this, you understand this, and there are other folks who are not engaged. How do you make sure that they remain engaged?
Probably the best example that I can give is what President Cruzado described in terms of the initiatives. So when our campus was awarded our performance funding allocation last time, $2.1 million, the President Provost immediately went out and had a call for proposals. And so a good example is in the College of Engineering. We examined where is it in our curriculum that we see students are stumbling. Where do we have issues with retentions? Where is it taking students longer to get through? And we saw that in a lot of our sophomore level engineering mechanics courses, students spent a lot of time churning and retaking courses. And so one of the proposals that came from the College of Engineering was to offer a more enhanced recitation session that was chaired by, or that was overseen by faculty members, but we had PhD students that were working with smaller groups of students and helping them with their engineering mechanics problems. And of course, it's still early in the process, but the feedback we're getting from students and from faculty who teach those courses has been outstanding and indicating that was working. And so that same process happened through all of our colleges, where departments started looking at, in math, for instance. We know that math is a hindrance to many students. well, here's some money. What is it that we could do with some extra funding to help these students? And so there were quite a few initiatives that were started. And I can say that really changed the culture and the spirit of performance funding on our campus, because I think faculty started seeing, well, there could be some good that comes from this. So that's one example that I could provide.
And that's helpful, and I appreciate the example. And certainly, there has been a change, I can tell, just since the process began. And I don't think it's the worst thing in the world that there was sort of some adversarial conversation that was going on, because it did stir the interest. And I think that's okay. And the fact that now you have Dr. Crawford involved in spite of himself, that's a real positive. Regent Sheehy.
I had a follow-up to Fran's question. I thought the answer to Fran's question, how do we keep them engaged, is the money. And if it is the money, am I right about that? Isn't that the whole point, that we're enticing them with this extra money, with the division of money?
Madam Chair, Regent Sheehy, I'd say the money creates the interest and the focus, but I don't think that an individual faculty member internalizes the money per se.
Well,
That's just my opinion.
That's my follow-up question. If the performance-based funding, the incentive is there's money available, and you're now sort of in a competition to get that money, how does the money how does that incentive flow down to an individual faculty member? Is it the competition, the idea that you're now setting better goals because there's money involved? Is it the process? What is it that about the money and the availability of this little competition, big competition really, that incentivizes the individual faculty members? Because it sounds like from what you're saying, that they become engaged in this process of determining, well, what's the problem in this department? What's the classes that we're not offering? What's the math problem? And then applying the money to that to find the solution. Is that right?
Regent Sheehy, Commissioner Christian wanted to jump in.
Regent Sheehy, Madam Chair, I just take a stab at that. I think one of the things is you got to be careful not to equate it just sort of piece to piece to what a private sector compensation sort of funding scheme is. I think it's not that, but it doesn't need to be that, because it's already driving the conversation. And it's already driving it at a much more significant level than purely funding on headcount did, right? I mean, that's one thing we keep talking to the legislature and others that will listen about, is we've had performance funding a long time. We just allocated funds based on FTE before, and now there's other criteria. And that criteria alone is creating a focus. I mean, the fact that we're having this conversation about it, the fact that we've had vigorous debates about quality, about student success, about retention, completion, to me, that in itself is what the money is driving, and that's worth the price of the money already. And so, I think from that standpoint, it's working extremely well. And I think that it is that money that will continue to drive it at an institutional, a department level, and ultimately, I think, even to a faculty level, they understand that the department needs to do well, the institution needs to do well, that we're competing for those funds. And that does drive it, but we've got to use a little caution that we don't try to compare that to a private sector sort of bonus structure compensation. I don't think it's going to be that, and I don't think that probably exists in public higher education. But
I agree, and I agree with what you're saying about the money's role in this. But as we move forward with the conversation, I think it's important to figure out, why is it working? It's not that direct relationship that you have in the private sector between I make more money because I did better at my job. It's a little bit different thing. So I think it's really important as we apply money to this process. And I think our goal is to increase the amount of money available through performance funding eventually.
Yeah.
I think it's important to answer Fran's question, and I don't know that we know the answer yet. But there is something very good happening. But to make it better, I think we have to understand what it is that's driving the faculty. And it may just be the conversation that may be the answer. I don't know. But I think it's really important to have that discussion, not just at this table, but at the tables where the people we need to incentivize are sitting.
Yeah, Regent Sheehy, Madam Chair, I think it is driving the institution. And I think in identifying what's keeping the momentum going, it is driving the institution, and I think that does have an effect at a department level and a faculty level. It's not as direct as a private sector compensation, but it is driving. I mean, that is a lot of the focus. That's from the president, the provost. We're having a lot of those conversations because of the funding and the need to maintain that in their budgets and to achieve that goal, whether it's a competition at MSU or what. We're thinking about that, and it's created some thought to drive what has been board goals in terms of retention and completion, to where that was tough to accomplish before. We would talk a lot about it, but with nothing on the line, nothing drove those conversations. I think now, at least at an institutional level, there is a stake in the game that is really driving the conversation, and I think it will continue to. And I think, yeah, we do anticipate a larger percentage of the funding driving that. But again, I like that it switches the focus from how many students can we get into the door to how many students can we get out of the door, to that student success piece, not purely how many show up on the first day. And it really, you know, and faculty do care what happens to those students. That is absolute. But it does help the entire organization try to drive toward those goals. It's not just a faculty member trying to help a student succeed. It's the entire structure trying to help the student succeed, for better advising, for different hours, different sections. I mean, all of those things start to flow together to help that faculty member. I don't think it's that the faculty didn't care before. They did. But it's creating sort of organic growth within the structure to say, this is important to the organization, and we're going to see us work toward that end.
Chancellor Blackadder.
Regent Albrecht, members of the board, I just wanted to weigh in kind of on that faculty side in terms of the incentive. I mean, I think there's been, and Bob and I talked about this a little bit, you know, performance-based funding didn't make chancellors and presidents and deans focus on student success and retention necessarily, but I do agree with Commissioner Christian in terms of elevating the conversation. You ask how it motivates faculty members. Many times it's the resources that President Cruzado talked about and others have talked about in terms of just saying, where are we going to invest our dollars? So maybe it drives the budget process more. And the faculty have always been, I mean, there may be a few outliers that don't care, but faculty members want to be involved in successful programs and have their students be successful, and they want to have those students graduate and go out and get work, right? And sometimes it's just a matter of some resources that can go their way to help them. So I think it's much more altruistic than simple financing, but it has helped us focus. You know, we have a new director of student success, and we have a freshman engineering program that we're trying. We're trying some things a little bit different. Every institution is. And so to sort of say, I would caution you to sort of say, how do I motivate that faculty member? Okay, because I think they're highly motivated. We need to give them opportunities and resources. And if I could just build on that and just say, instead of giving student scholarships, right, if our goal is to have student success, if you have excess dollars, invest it into student success, right? Do the same kind of competitive thing, you know, rather than take the money away from an institution that has struggling in an area, somehow, you know, provide them an opportunity to compete so that they can use those funds to be more successful in what we want to accomplish. And scholarships may not be the answer. Maybe they are. Thank you very much.
Thank you. President Ingstrom, did you have?
Yes, thank you, Regent Albrecht, members of the board. I wanted to really emphasize, I think, what Don was just saying, that non-retention is, there are certainly academic contributions to non-retention and things that are in the hands of the individual faculty members. But there are many other things that contribute to non-retention that are really sort of out of the hands of the individual faculty member, or at least that at least rely upon support services, offices of student success, advising centers, learning communities, things like that. And so the performance funding model, just within the context of the entire budget, allows us to move some resources into those support areas that really have, in many ways, at least as much effect on retention as an individual faculty member does. So it's not so much a model a performance bonus to an individual faculty member or any other individual for that matter, but it is the ability to adjust resources into those areas, both academic and non-academic, that contribute ultimately to student success.
Great points. Regent Kraus.
Thank you. Boy, we got fuzzy. I just wanted to point out, he didn't say you asked a good question. Not all of them are good questions, apparently. We're all just here to get our questions graded. Maybe it's just me, not as fuzzy or warm as, but I think there is there is an issue of performance. It is called performance funding, and so performance matters, right? And whether it's undergraduate degrees and certificates awarded or a much higher level of success for targeted groups, those are going to be graded. Those are going to be rewarded. Those are going to be things that we want to see money flow into the fastest horses, the people that are making that success, or if there's a problem at an institutional level, that's addressed so those things are achieved. So is it a fancy way of just emphasizing what it is we said before? I'm not sure that's the thing. And we could say we don't want anybody to lose, but we want the dollars to make a difference. And so my question, I guess, is phrased that way. So the model, and because I'm worried about the messages. Well, nobody's losing, or it's all going to be the same, more or less. Is the model too smoothed out to make a difference? Would we have made it? Would the money go differently to the institutions? Just if we awarded it some other way based on if you report it out? Will it result in different decisions? Is it enough money to affect that? So it's two things. It's the model and the sufficiency of funds to actually do something. And I think there is a piece of it. Maybe I don't know how we pitched it because I wasn't there at the legislature, that we said this will make a difference in what you, the legislature, want to do too. I mean, I think we told them that way. So my question is it going to make a difference, setting this aside, is it going to make a difference in the outcomes we're trying to achieve, and other than jawboning? Will it make more difference than jawboning? Now, I didn't put the jawboning in when I wrote this question this morning, but since the answer is jawboning, what I really want to know is, will the money make a difference too?
To whom are you asking the question, Regent Kraus?
Madam Chair, Regent Kraus, I think
The people that are doing it, right?
I can start with that. Let's talk about the percent that we're putting in. We're roughly at moving from 5% to 10% of state appropriations. We can compare that to the 25 other states that have some form of performance funding right now. That moves us to about the middle, headed towards the higher end, actually. All we can use is what's happened in other states so far, because we're really on the front end of this. We have the pilot model, which was dipping our toe into the big water, our big toe into the water, and or the big water, whichever way you want to say it. Are the dollar amounts the right amount? I think they are, personally. The amount of attention that has been focused on this, just even when it was $7.5 million, and now moving to $15 million a year, 1/3 of that, or 30% of it, would be UM, and the other third would be MSU. Ask them if that has got their attention. Absolutely, it has. Will it drive the outcomes we want? Because that's what performance funding is about driving outcomes and paying for what we value, at least in some form. I hope it does. I hope every campus improves and every campus gets every single dollar because they grew. And the way the model is set up, if they do, they will. Every one of them will get 100%. Now, the part that you're asking about is what about those that don't grow and they still get money? And that is a fact. We have it's called the stop-loss zone. And from those 25 other states, we took the best and the most recommended model, and inside of it says, use that stop-loss zone. Don't be overly punitive with performance-based funding because it gets you nowhere. It just lets institutions that are already going down or having trouble spiral. So we do not want that to happen. And so how do you stop it from happening? That's the chart that we showed you there with the stop-loss zone. And so it has to be smoothed over to some degree, particularly when we're looking at campuses that weigh so heavily upon recent high school Montana graduates. And we are at the all-time low right now in the last 10 years. The pipe is constrained. It's going to come out. It's all going to come out the other end, and it's going to be in a growth cycle again. We're still seeing a little bit of that from the recession when we had high student enrollments affecting the outcomes that we're seeing. But I would imagine that some campuses are going to struggle more than others because of that restriction in the pipe. So we need that smoothing, and we need some protection for those institutions. But at the same time, we want to continue the importance of performance funding, and then by putting the dollars next to what we value, even a small amount, we've seen the incredible amount of attention that is raised to the topic of just retention. I stood up here in the past, maybe 8 years ago, and showed you charts on retention. And it was, people nodding their heads, yeah. Now I could ask anybody in this room what retention means, or is it fall to spring? I mean, people come up to me when I walk in the room and say, we got to move that back to fall to spring retention. The level of excitement and attention around that would never be like this if it wasn't for us, for you raising that topic through this. So I can't answer on a real one-to-one basis on you there, but that's my opinion and what I think you're asking.
Yeah, because it wasn't a good question, because I'm not sure what I'm asking, but it does have to do with how does it make a difference. The other thing that, as I look at what we said we wanted to do, and one of them is very concrete, is sort of the high level of success for targeted groups. But when I move it up to the next level, which is what we're responsible for, which is sometimes thought of as to the people of Montana, and what their targets are, and I think of the Main Street plan, and are we, and we didn't really put that much into here, or maybe we did, and you can tell me where it is, where we said, oh, look at the Main Street plan, and are we matching the demands and opportunities of graduates with who we're producing, with what we're producing, and is that in here somewhere, or we're going to have to handle that on a curriculum level, because at some basic level, performance funding does have a curriculum basis to it too. I think much more so than individual professor basis.
Madam Chair, Regent Kraus, yes, it is in there, and yes, it is connected to Main Street Montana, and it goes like this: workforce development, a key element of Main Street Montana. Our campus, in phase 2, we moved the metrics to emphasize institutional specific missions, particularly isolating the 2-year from the 4-year. Inside of that, we have, dual enrollment. I think that's key. And then the issues of success and remediation, transferability, credit accumulation, all specific to the 2-year campuses. Where on the other end of the continuum, we have the doctoral flagship campuses and research, another key component of Main Street Montana. Now expenditures for research dollars, part of the funding model. So at that level, yeah, it's in there. At the curriculum level, no, it's not.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have a robust agenda here, and so I want to make sure to get Dr. Steve Lodmill the opportunity to provide input, unless you're not finished. Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah,
Dr.
I'd just
Lodmill.
like to make a couple of, Madam Chair, thank you, members of the board. So we're still fairly early into this, and it's a little hard from a faculty's perspective to see really where this is going, but certainly the question is, where is the nexus of the performance and who's controlling the money? But the important thing is that it has raised the attention, it's gotten the attention of faculty, and it has raised the discussion in a very productive way. And so certainly from a faculty's perspective, if there were obvious, tangible, immediate benefits that we could see for performance-based funding, that would be one way to go. The opposite, the other way, is the worry from faculty is how do you cut your way to success? That is the danger of failing in some performance metric and then receiving a little less money. How do we improve from there? So I think we do have to be careful that this is that we incentivize by in a positive way and not try to recover if we've lost money. So.
Thank you. Okay, Regent Williams.
I kind of want to switch gears a tiny bit, but it piggybacks off of what Dr. Lodmill was saying. I'm curious how in instances where maybe a campus might be insufficient or not improving in areas, how we're measuring the areas of need that we want to see improvement. You know, we're seeing that those metrics aren't improving, but if we're picking out maybe the reasons why and how we're analyzing those in order to really help that campus grow and do better there. It's kind of switching gears a little bit. But.
Madam Chair, Regent Williams, so at the system office, we measure at about the 10,000 foot level. Let's say a campus's retention rates are going down. At the campus level, and it's pointed out here, at the campus level, I can assure you they slice that data 1,000 different ways. They can talk about retention in terms of what was the first math class you took, or how many years was it since your last math class. Did you see an advisor? Were you in a mentoring group? They build models based around what shapes a successful college student. I don't have that information nearly as an accessible or detailed level as the campuses do. I know both of the lead institutional researchers from UM and MSU are in the room. I'm not going to ask them to report on this, but that would make an incredibly interesting presentation, though. The predictive analytics, basically, that the campuses can get to now, it ties back into our level of data that we have and the quality of the data that we have and the quality of data that we would like someday to have. So it's a great question. It's being done, I assure you. Student success offices, that's what it's based around, is figuring out how do you get students to become more successful.
It seems to me that analytical piece might be a place to put money that's not garnered by a campus into really analyzing those issues.
Madam Chair, Regent Williams, I think that's the beauty of performance funding. It gives the institution the prerogative to do that. If that's where they're deficient, if that's what they deem, then put the money there. Maybe they need a new business analytic tool, and they need to get to that level of data. This is a form of an incentive to reinvest money in a certain area.
Mm-hmm. Good points. Regent Robinson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll be brief because Mariah covered one of the comments that I wanted to mention, and I've heard some great participation in this because I think it is important. One of the things I wanted to mention that I heard, and I've heard over the past few years, is I don't think there's any doubt of the motivation of the faculty, and I really liked, Bob, what you had to say about truly being the gatekeepers of that quality education. You wouldn't say that, and faculty wouldn't say that if that wasn't a motivation. I'm not saying it's your only motivation. I'm sure you still have to pay your light bill and everything, but I think that's most important in this because when the funding is going to that institution, I trust that they are putting it where it's going to maximize the benefit in order to provide a higher quality education for the students that we serve. So that said, a couple comments on the model that I'd like to give is the cap that you discussed. I like that. I like that, you have a second year with the residual funds if they haven't acquired those or earned those, that they're given a chance, but then there is a cap. And so those residual funds get redirected to something that it could be utilized for. I think we've heard of a couple comments already, and Don had mentioned some here. It could even be geared towards student performance. It's still performance funding, but it could be towards student performance. And even one example we heard here with Mr. Longenecker about trying to increase the number of credits that students take. If they're taking 15 credits and they're being successful and they're coming back again and again, perhaps there's a way to direct it towards those particular students too. So I would like if the group could start to take a look at some of those opportunities too, to utilize the residual funds and how it might be best utilized within the whole system. Ultimately, that it's always increasing the quality of education that we're offering. So thank you for all the great work.
Thank you. And Tyler?
Madam Chair, if I might, just a couple last words here to sew this all up. First, thank you, board members, for taking your time and your attention to such an important topic for us. And really, the thanks goes to these guys. They are truly experts, and to have their participation at this level out of the goodness of their heart. They weren't getting paid for any of this. These Friday meetings, every Friday at 1 o'clock, nobody got any extra pay for it. And I know everybody had a lot of other things to be doing, so I highly appreciated it. This project wouldn't work without their participation. And the final thing is, we'll be back for this topic in May. I know everybody's thankful for that. But at that time, we're going to ask for your approval for the model and the dollars that we're going to run through it. So this was a primer to that, knowing that it's a very detailed and important conversation. We wanted to get a head start.
Thank you, and I appreciate the broad spectrum of the net that you threw out to make sure that everybody had the opportunity across the campuses to participate. I think that really helps with the ownership and engagement, so thanks for all you've done. Thank you, Mr. Tyler. And at this point, I would like to move on to the next item. And I would like to invite Asa Holman forward, president of the Montana Associated Students.
Madam Chair, thank you. Members of the board. Madam Chair, with your permission, I'd like to just hand out this resolution passed by the Montana Associated Students last night.
Yes.
So, as you're all well aware, what we're going to be talking about for the next few moments is a request from the students across the state, student governance across the state, for annual fee review for student-driven fees. So I'll start this off, and I'll be brief so that way there's plenty of time for questions or discussion, but I'm going to start this off by just reading to you the current policy and the proposed change. It's policy 940-12-1. Section A, approval of a schedule of tuition and fees will take place once every 2 years, normally during the May meeting of odd-numbered years. Requests for approval of tuition and fees at other times will only be entertained upon demonstration of extenuating circumstances. It is our proposal that we add a line at the end of that will state, student-driven fees need not demonstrate extenuating circumstances and may be seen annually. We would also add that we would add a definition in this same policy that would be student-driven fees are fees proposed through the student government organizations on a given campus that students have had the opportunity to vote in support or opposition of. Only in the case that a fee is approved by a majority of voting students may a fee be presented as a student-driven fee. So with that, recognizing that we've had this conversation in the past, including this academic year, but also going back now for really several years, at least 4, if not further. I will just mention to you, just kind of highlight some of the reasons why we've talked about in the past that students support this. I think chief amongst those is a desire from student governments to be responsive. We have the unique situation of being on the ground with the students every single day. We are students ourselves, and we, more than anybody else, are responsive to students or answer to students. Students are in our classes, they're our fellows, and they tell us every day, and they are very rarely shy about what they need or what they feel. Because of this, it's important for student governments to have the ability to be responsive, to act upon requests from the student from the student body. And the reason for that is students will tune out, as I'm sure all of you are well aware. But if a student in the system feels that their requests or their needs have gone unanswered, the result of that is frequently that they'll leave the institution or they'll leave higher education in general. Now that's the extreme situation. There's also just students who continue their education and feel somewhat neglected. But I think the ideal for everybody is to have every student feel that all of their needs are being met to the best of our ability. And that's what student governments seek to do, meet the needs of students that aren't being met by the overall system or that need to be met on a smaller scale. I think that right now, I actually know right now that our system is trying to be incredibly flexible. We're being flexible in terms of workforce development needs, we're being flexible in terms of state needs, and we're being flexible in terms of academic needs. And what we're asking for is to be flexible to our constituents, to be flexible on a yearly basis. I'll remind you all that student-driven fees are voted on by students and are the only fees that can only be seen by this board if voted on by students directly in our elections. Student fees account for some of the smaller fee packages that students pay. And anecdotally, well, not anecdotally, actually factually, I'll tell you a story right now that, and then I'll kind of leave it at that, that last year ASMSU, the student body of ASMSU, had a fee for a change to their outdoor recreation program. In coordination with that fee was also a request to reduce their student activity fee. So that way they could increase the outdoor recreation fee while not increasing the overall package that a student would pay. So they were voluntarily reducing their activity fee. The need for this was because students had made it very well known that there was not enough equipment, there was not enough opportunities, and that their needs weren't being met in terms of recreating outdoors. I think it's worth noting that about 60% of students who attend school in Montana identify outdoor recreation as a key reason why they're here. As a result of this, the outdoor recreation program at MSU conducted an extensive survey about what students want and needed. At the result of that survey, they went to the student government and asked the student government to react. The student government did react by passing a fee on their spring ballot that passed the student body overwhelmingly. But because it was an even-numbered year, it was not heard by this board. We certainly understand the reasons for keeping fees in balance with the overall package. We certainly understand the need to keep fees in check with tuition, and we certainly understand the need for fees not to outpace tuition that we are always keeping down. But we also feel that student-driven fees are unique amongst the fee package, and that student governments across the state have demonstrated not only leadership in terms of the programming we offer, but have demonstrated fiscal conservancy with our money year after year, that we're not bad with our money. We don't come for we're not in trouble with our money. We're not going into the red. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions, and I'll just stick around while you guys talk about it.
Thank you, Asa. Regent Sheehy.
Was there any discussion about seeking an exemption from the May requirement? That's the May meeting only. And my question is whether there's some problem with a student fee being heard other than at May. So I have a question for you and a question for the commissioner.
So I'll answer that first. We just don't see a need amongst ourselves to address a fee earlier than May. I mean, we operate on a yearly basis, and our elections are in a set time of the year. And we don't bring fees to this body that have not been passed by the students, so May is the sensible time to have that.
Okay, then no need to answer.
Commissioner? Oh.
I answered.
Oh, okay. Any other questions? Regent Kraus.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're welcome.
So what kind of turnout do you have for student elections?
Madam Chair, that varies widely across the system. Some of our schools have as high as 30%. Some of our schools are significantly lower than that. But I do think it's worth noting in coordination with that question that we have stop loss geared into that. So for instance, at the University of Montana, we can't bring a fee to this body even if it was supported by a majority of students if at least 12% of the student body didn't vote in the election. So.
Yeah, that's the question I wanted to get out there was how do you avoid getting captured by a tiny minority if you have a very low turnout? Thank you for answering that. anticipating that question.
Okay, if there are no further questions.
I actually
Oh,
have.
go ahead, sorry, Regent Sheehy.
My other question actually has to do with the drafting. I think that I like everything you did and the definition. I think it's pretty clear. And this could be a question because when I drove up here yesterday, I listened to Nina Totenberg explaining in excruciating details what the problems were with the phrase "established by the states." So I wonder if you want to change that word "seen," because we don't actually see. You know, it says here. Student-driven fee changes need not demonstrate extenuating circumstance and may be seen annually. And the words in the other parts of this policy all talk about requested. And I don't know, I would just suggest that you would take a look at that language before you submit it for the final review and attach that as a clause to the second sentence because it only modifies the second sentence, and use request instead of fee.
Madam Chair, Regent Sheehy, thank you for the suggestion.
Regent Johnstone.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner Christian, could you comment on it from the standpoint of your thoughts and the reason for the policy, please?
Regent Johnstone, Madam Chair, I'd be glad to. So we've actually visited this probably half a dozen times over the last while. The policy, and I think back to your original question is how often do we do it? We have seen fee requests at off-cycle, I mean, other than even May meetings under the extenuating circumstance clause if there's a need. One that pops into my mind was when insurance regulations changed on 15-passenger minivans. We did something at a September meeting. So, you know, it happens. But I think in general, the answer to that question is that we just in the body of board policy decided that we didn't want to visit fees, tuition, all of those on too frequent a basis, and we didn't really want to visit them all sort of independent of each other. I mean, when you look at fees of any nature, one at a time, it's a $2 or $3 increase. That's fine. You know, and I understand that, and it's not just the students that need those fees or the passion behind them or the reason behind them or the sort of drive to get something done. I mean, literally, whether it's a fee in the chemistry department or you name it, there's good reasons behind it. But I think in the overall scope of affordability, we've sort of looked at consolidating the requests so the regents have the ability to look at them in aggregate, to look at them together. So you're not just $1 here and $1 there, but when we look at them in May and you look at them in concert with everything else, all of those fees added up are $276, if memory serves me right, of the last time, something in that neighborhood per campus. And then you start to say, well, that's a real dollar number, and that has meaning, and you have a better opportunity to say, well, if that's too much, what's going to give and what isn't, or how do those work together in concert? And so I think that Regent Johnstone is kind of what was behind the original drafting of the board policy that says we'll look at it every other year. I will tell you quite candidly the timing of that is that follows the legislative session, and that's in the body of it. And so we know following each session what we have to spend for the next 2 years and how that balance of state and tuition funding mix will be. And you know, I think candidly it's the furthest from the next session too in terms of sort of the fallout from those decisions. You know, we got to be careful with the message too. And I will be honest, the students have to be careful with the message too, because we don't want to ever leave the impression that students don't care if we raise fees or we don't care if we raise fees. I mean, it's all part of what we need to do when we're talking to our taxpayer partners in this equation, and we're asking them to support this, and we're making a case, which we have for the last decade, that this can't all come out of the students' pockets. The state needs to have their piece in there. So I think, in my mind, as a former board member and in this role, that's been sort of the basis behind it. But I would add this on the tail end. Ultimately, the students vote to propose a fee to the board. And if the board you know, takes it in that light and understands the final decision rests with the board, the frequency of a proposal or what is surrounding that is probably something that can be worked with. It's just the board needs to know it's got to take it in aggregate when it does those, and it's got to evaluate sort of the overall picture, the overall affordability impact to students, not just the $1 that we're adding here, the $9 fee that we're adding, and be prudent in our response. Ultimately, that's kind of how the decision tree works, and that's why I think even the extenuating circumstance piece has worked. When we have to address them off-cycle, we can. But I think, from my perspective, that's sort of what has been behind it, and I think we've had good discussions, but it's always good to look at this, and this is an information item. We're going to have this will come back as an action item, and I think that it is time for it to come back as an action item so the students get feedback as to what the board's thinking, whether that's we want to do this or we don't. But we really wanted to introduce it today, and I appreciate the question, Regent Johnstone, because it gives you a little background for how we got to this spot and I guess why it hasn't been changed up to this point in time. But certainly, I think it's the right time to look at it, and we can decide what is the most appropriate steps moving forward.
Okay. Thank you. I had one observation and one other question, if I might.
Certainly.
Chair. My question is, has there ever been any consideration of sunsetting fees or requiring that periodically that these fees be revisited?
If you're talking about fees in general, I couldn't speak to whether historically that conversation has been had. If you're talking about student-driven fees?
Student fees, yeah.
I think students would be more than open to the idea of sunset clauses on our fees, but I would add to the caveat to that students would not be interested in having our fees be subject to more scrutiny than other fees. Our fees should be treated, if not with more respect, at least as much respect. And so I think that the idea of sunsetting fees is probably an important discussion to be had with regards to every fee.
Okay. And then I guess my observation would be, based on what I've heard, I think I'm generally supportive of making a change. Like Martha, I might like to take some time working on the drafting of it to incorporate some of the thoughts that the commissioners expressed in terms of what's important when we look at a fee. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent Johnstone. President Engstrom?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to just give you our campus perspective on this. I have 2 points to make. First, I support the general notion that the students are going with this. I think we can and should take pride in the level of activism of our student government in the Montana University system. I think we have a level of engagement there that is rare in higher education systems, and so I'm supportive of equipping the students with tools to accomplish what they feel are their objectives. And given the yearly turnover in most cases of student government, this does give a particular student government body the ability to make some change. So in generally, I'm supportive of that. I do want to make the second point, however, and that is I want to make sure that we preserve the right or whatever of the institutions to weigh in on any given fee consideration. Just because it comes from the students doesn't necessarily mean that the administration supports it or thinks it's the right thing to do. And given the commissioner's comments, whether explicit or implied, there are limits to fee increases in any given biennium. And so there may be a case where the administration views some other kind of a fee as a higher priority up against that ultimate cap. So, but with that caveat, I think that this is a good direction to go.
Do you believe, President Engstrom, do you believe that the verbiage needs to be included to ensure that, or do you believe that's inherent, the opportunity to weigh in? It's in there?
Do you want to answer that, Clay? I don't know if the language is in there already, just in terms of student fees, that it requires
Madam Chair,
input.
I think that it absolutely is in there. And what I started to say earlier, maybe I got a little sidetracked, but it ultimately is the board's decision, right? And so nothing changes there. Even in terms of a sunset, I think there's a process to get the fees to the board, and the board ultimately has the say. And sunset may be appropriate on some fees and not on others. So I think that could even be a one at a time, or, especially ones that maybe come in the off season. I think the board could say, depending on the nature of it, can set all kinds of parameters around any sort of increase. That's always at the board's discretion and within their prerogative. And so I think as long as the process, I think, which is what President Engstrom is saying, remains in place, and that it doesn't circumvent that, there is an ability to work within it. But the board has a say in approving fees, and it can't diminish that, in my opinion. Is that ultimately is the role of the board, to make certain that all of these things balance together.
Thank you. President Cruzado.
Yes, Madam Chair, members of the board, I also want to add my voice to what President Engstrom was stating, and also to remind us that everything in the university setting is a teachable moment. Every process, every act, everything we do on a daily basis in our campuses is a teachable moment, and student fees are not an exception. By the time these proposals reach your desk, there has been an extensive conversation between student leaders among themselves, but also with staff, with the presidents, with the chancellors, also internally with the commissioner. We take each other's temperature constantly so that we don't take you by surprise, nor are we taken by surprise. There have been times in which, because of a variety of reasons, we have determined that a good fee, it's not the right path to take at that moment. And I just need to say that students have always been open to and receptive to that type of guidance. So I just want for you to understand that, as the commissioner says, you, of course, preserve that discretion, that criterion, if you will. But rest assured that shared governance in our campuses encompasses the students, and by the time they come here, we have all learned a lot about their needs, their justifications, and we think it's a good opportunity for you to approve it. And that's, you need to have that confidence.
Thank you, President Cruzado. Asa.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I also just wanted to add, given the kind of conversation that we just had, to be clear, that the students don't want in any way to degrade the system. We're not asking for the Board of Regents to approve every fee on every year. We're just asking that they will see those fees. And I think it's very important to note that they can also not make it to the Board of Regents because of conversations with administration back on our home campuses. And again, that is not a system that we are looking to degrade. And I would offer to you that student fees are the most heavily scrutinized, because not only do they have to make it past our individual Senate bodies, they then have to make it to a vote of the students. They then have to make it past the administration, and then ultimately they have to make it past this board. That is the system that we appreciate as students. That is the system that works very well. We don't want to degrade it. We just want to enhance it by allowing students to have the buy-in, to be an active part of the system, even if they were unlucky enough right now to have been elected in a non-fee review year.
Thank you, Asa, and thank you for your leadership and your engagement. I would like to, I am so sorry. One moment. Regent Robinson.
Thank you, Madam
I'm
Chair.
sorry.
I just had a few comments, because I was on the board a couple years ago when we considered this discussion before, and I was one of those that voted against it at that time. I remember the meeting, also a part of the meeting that we had a very vigorous conversation about student debt and default rates that were rising, and at the same time considering increasing student fees at that particular time. And it wasn't something that I was in favor of that time. I do want to say that, that's why I think we sit here on the board, is to hear those appeals. You all came back. You did the work that you needed to do in order to bring it forward for us to consider, and that is part of the process. And so I really commend you for that, and those that helped you with it as well, Asa. The questions I have that I'd like you to consider is, one was brought up was, certainly time of year is a real concern, because for it to come in at various times of the year is really hard. As you can see with all of the items that we have to cover, it's hard to consider each time. So that's something to consider. Not saying it's not doable every year, but it should be one time a year. The other, to me, is related to Regent Krause's question about the vote and how that's determined. I have a concern about students that may not participate on that level, but yet those that do vote and say this is what we want and it passes here, that they may not be able to afford that fee. And so that's something that I'm concerned about, of passing those fees on to some students that say, I really don't want that additional fee, a student fee at the gymnasium or something like that, because this is really my focus over here. So that's something I would like addressed, at least, whether it's now or later. The other thing for me too is the I guess the whole voting process. So that's one big question that I have regarding this. The other is the type of fees. What type of fees might we be considering? Is it an open book? Do we need parameters on that as a board? And then lastly, and it sounds like it's already worked into our policy, but President Engstrom had mentioned the cap. Certainly there is, as responsible board members to manage the whole system, not just student fees, but the whole system, that we need to make sure that we have a limit that we're considering, so that we don't go beyond that. So again, it makes it impossible for other students that maybe can't afford those fees to continue their education.
Madam
Thank
Chair.
you.
Oh,
Yes, go
if I
ahead.
may, thank you. And those are all very valid points, and so I would like to just address them briefly. We are specifically only asking for annual review at the May Board of Regents meetings, not at any other month, just in the May meeting. The only difference is, rather than happening in odd-numbered years, is it will have the ability to happen in even-numbered years as well as odd-numbered years. But we're not looking for fee review to happen at every meeting or more than one meeting, just one meeting per year. And then that's all we want, and that's really all we have built into our system to accommodate. In terms of the affordability of fees, I think that that's an incredibly valid point, but I also would remind you that at the end of the day, this board makes those decisions, and we are very supportive of that. So if a fee comes to this board and the decision at this board is that not enough students voted, or that there is not demonstrated enough need, or that the fee is only helping a select few of students when it needs to help a broader range, then I would offer that this board has not only the ability but the duty to vote down that fee, and that students are also keenly aware of that. And finally, in terms of the types of fees, we are speaking strictly of student fees, fees that are going to be collected by students and spent by students through our collection process. And in terms of what types of fees those could be, I don't think there'd be any problem with that. I think that those fees are almost always going to be for new programming. So as long as it was at least for new programming, that wouldn't be a problem. And then your final point that you made, which I neglected to mention earlier, but I think is very important, is that I think that it is completely appropriate and something that we would all support to have a cap for students, just that we have for everything else, and that it would feed into the system. So if the cap overall for our university is going to be 3%, and we're bringing a fee in an even-numbered year that has passed our students and our administration, it would make sense to me that that fee would not be able to be above a certain percent of our overall activity fee. That we're speaking about percentages, small percentages. So if we're thinking 3%, then on an even-numbered year, it would be natural that it would be capped at 1.5% or something along those lines. And I think that that, again, is something that this board doesn't need to have written in this policy, because this board has that oversight at all times.
Thank you, Asa. Regent Kraus?
Thanks. I had my question answered. I didn't chime in on my thoughts, and I wanted to chime in on those. I think of them a little bit like term limits. I think one year we had a vote, and I told you, nope, I'm not hiding behind the every other year thing. I'm just voting no on what you asked for, right? So my advice to the regents is cowgirl up and vote no when you want to vote no, and don't try to defer it a year or hide behind process, but just look at them critically, consider the issues, and vote. And if you don't vote for it, don't be swayed, So, it's a matter of priorities, and just put it out there. And it's the reason I say it's like term limits is we have term limits. It's at the vote every year. You can always say no.
Regent Williams?
As many people in this room know, I've been kind of heavily involved with this for a long time through the Montana Associated Students and here now. And it seems that there's a lot of input on maybe changes to the policy language. And I was just putting out that I'd be happy to kind of funnel those and help come back with a revised policy. I'm happy to take point on that with President Homan and sort of manage that process if that's the will of the board.
That'd be great. Asa, thank you. And thank you to all the students who have invested time in this. Next, I would like to move on and invite Chancellor Nook forward to give us an update on MSU Billings budget planning. Chancellor Nook.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the Regents. It's really an honor and a privilege to be able to talk a little bit about where we're at with our budget planning at MSUB. As all of you know, we've tried to keep you and everyone else in the state informed about what we see as some challenges in the budget at MSU Billings. And it's nice to have an opportunity to take a little step back and talk with you about it, give you an opportunity to ask us some questions as well. As we've moved through this process and looking at our budget and making the announcements and finding out where we're going to make the reductions that balance our budget, the first thing I want to point out is that these are not easy decisions to make. We know we're talking about people's lives. We know we're talking about how we serve students. And we've got to take that very, very seriously. And in doing so, we established a set of budget principles that are up here before you. And I think the publishing of those principles and vetting those on our campus has been key to how we have not only made these budget reductions, but how we have been able to get buy-in from faculty, from staff, and from members of our community. And I really want to emphasize that first budget principle, and that was to minimize the impact on our students and invest in their long-term success. All of our budget decisions grew out of that. And that one really focused or forced us to make the fourth principle, to establish the fourth principle as well, and that's to ensure that we make strategic reductions and reallocations, and that what we don't do is make unilateral or opportunistic cuts. We really focus on where we're going to be able to set the university up, where we have programs, whether they're in academic affairs or athletics or student affairs or administrative affairs, where things are declining, where there is less student enrollment, less student involvement, we make reductions there, and not where we have patterns of growth. None of this would have been possible without leadership throughout the university, and I in particular want to thank Trudy Collins, our budget director. She is one of the best I have ever worked with. She is fantastic in pulling these things together. But also Terry Iverson, our Vice Chancellor for Administrative Affairs, Joe Oravec, our Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs, Krista Montague, our Athletic Director, and certainly Mark Pagano, our Provost, also Aaron Klinging-Smith, our External Relations Director, for helping us put together some of our media relationships. I have to say, before I go on, I have been very impressed with the way that the university community has responded to these reductions. The faculty and the staff have really stepped up and been a part of figuring this out through the shared governance process on our University Budget Committee. I think their involvement early in the year, we got that committee together in September for the first time instead of, normally we get it together in February. But when we knew we had a problem not only with this year's budget, but the one we're talking about, next year's budget, it was good to have them on board, have them up to speed on how we do budgeting and what reductions needed to be made. Looking a little bit at where the budget issue came from, you can see the pieces in here. There's an estimated tuition revenue reduction because of the enrollment decline, state support reduction because of that enrollment decline. And one I want to point out because of the discussion earlier, we estimated back in November, and all of these numbers are going to change before May, that the state support reduction based on performance-based funding would cost us $1.58 million. And so, you know, the question about is the money enough? You bet it's enough. It's plenty. This has really caught the attention of our faculty and staff. It's clear that retention, that completion, that enrollment are all very important issues and that all of us need to be aware of. So the performance-based funding, I think, is a real important issue. As Chancellor Blackketter had pointed out, I think it's important that we do think about those residual funds and whether or not they're available for an institution like MSUB to be able to put together a grant proposal and say, I'd really like to be able to focus some of those funds that we left on the table to help me address some of those problems, to help this university address those problems. Not to solve the budget issue. We need to take care of that. But very focused, very specific on solving the performance issues, not the budget. What did we actually come up with? This next slide shows you the reductions that were made by what I consider the 5 major areas. There's a 6th one there that holds the general funds holds things like some money we use with bad debt and things like that to cover bad debt. But the Chancellor's area took a 16.4% reduction in the base budget in the Chancellor's office, athletics 11.4, academic affairs 9.9, administrative affairs 10, student affairs 10.1. I think you can see that we really did focus on trying to serve the students, especially the academic needs of our students first. Academic affairs has over 50% of this budget, but we didn't ask them to take the same size of budget cut as the other areas so that we could focus what we're doing on serving especially the academic needs of our students. There were 3 programs in particular that were slated for reductions, eliminations. Those have been talked about quite a little bit. Tennis is one of those. And that was by far the hardest decision I think we had to make because it was clear that there were 14 students we were going to have to look in the face and say, we're not going to have your sport. One of the ways that we chose to support them, because we did want to, as our primary principle says, limit the impact on students, we guaranteed that we would honor all of their athletic scholarships throughout the duration of their eligibility. We've already met with those students. We met with those students before the announcement. Some of them are working actively on transferring to other institutions. Some of them have decided to stay with us. They really do want to just complete their education here and not transfer at this time. We also looked at 2 academic programs, one of those in drafting and design where the enrollments had been low, and the other one in theater where we, again, had very low enrollments and completions in that program most recently. So overall, this is the big picture of what we ended up with for our cuts. Again, it isn't 10% across the board. There are programs that received no cuts, other programs that received substantial cuts. One other thing that I want to point out in our, especially in student affairs, we took 3 programs and put them together so that we could better serve students. We had a career services, we had our college success specialists, and we had an advising center. Our advising center had a student to advisor ratio of 450 to 1. The national average is 250 to 1. And so we combined career service and our academic advising and our college success specialists, and then we're going to do very holistic advising and be able to have students have the same advisors from the time they enter orientation all the way through until they graduate. And so it'll be a way for them to keep their contact with a single advisor if they want to, and help all of the advisors better serve our students. And also build stronger relationships with the faculty advisors as those students move from having their academic advising done by an advisor a professional advisor to a faculty member in their particular discipline. So, one of the things that has been the most difficult for us is the personnel cuts. And we made an effort to be as humane in these as possible, and that manifests itself in several ways. One of them, we made sure that everybody who we had to lay off got a notice before any of the public announcements came out. We also noticed many of our people who were going to receive notice long before the deadline for doing so. Some of the people that we noticed, we, by law, contract, had to give them 30 days notice. We noticed them in early February, and they will be working with us through the end of June. Some of the others we gave 30 notice, but we gave them the opportunity to not return to work for these 30 days so that they can look for a job. Sort of started immediately. So we were trying to be as humane to all of these people as possible. You'll notice that while we took nearly 40 full-time equivalent reductions of about 40 full-time positions, we only had to do 17 layoffs. And that's because we saw some of this coming even last year, and we had some temporary people in some of these positions. We didn't have to do a layoff. We knew their contracts ended at the end of the year. Some of these positions we simply kept open. So it's some great budget management by those vice chancellors that I'd mentioned earlier to see what was coming, kind of set things up so that we didn't hire someone and then tell them, well, I'm sorry, you don't have a job. And so we ended up with a much smaller number than what we could have. We also took the, we took the tack that there are some people we didn't actually have to notice. They had letters of appointment, but they'd had a few of them for a few years, and we went ahead and noticed them. Let them know this one isn't going to be able to, we're not going to be able to continue this. So we tried to be as humane in the announcement and the notification of employees about their job status as we could. Do it as early as possible and give them a heads up on what was coming. I want to really stop there and give you some chance for questions. I know we're running late. Almost everything that has happened is up on a website. This is the web address for that. The videos of the announcements to the various university are there, as well as transcripts, and then our actual budget documents are there as well. So, Madam Chair, thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor Nook. Chair Tuss.
Chancellor Nook, it's certainly no fun to cut budgets. Could you talk to us a little bit about growing your enterprise in terms of, my guess is that there has been some campus conversation about the reallocation of resources to grow what you're doing, including the student population, so in the future we avoid perhaps even deeper cuts. So it's not, I'm sure it's not just about cuts at MSU Billings. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, the biggest question that I've had from faculty and staff is, how do we know we're not going to have to do this next year, right? Is this a cycle? How do we know? And we've been through a couple budget cuts in the last 2 years. So there's a couple things going on. One, we've started the Student Success Committee, and we started that in October. One of our biggest challenges is actually retention. We have about a 60% retention rate from freshman to sophomore year. Many of us have talked about that really ought to be closer to 70%, even though we are working with some underrepresented populations. A large percentage of our population is underrepresented. And so getting that committee together and getting that retention rate up will be probably the most significant thing we can do. We are looking at how we recruit students as well. We do face several challenges in the recruitment of students, and one of them we've talked about a little bit earlier today, and that is that the demographics have been coming down, and that's true in the Billings High School as well. The number of students coming out of high school in the state of Montana has dropped. We've hit the bottom of that. Our enrollment pattern pretty much has followed that. It's been a little bit steeper. We do face a challenge, and I want to make sure that I talk about this as a challenge because it's both a benefit to us and a challenge to us, and that's the hot economy in eastern Montana, especially in Billings. With the Bakken, we have growing employment in the Billings area. We stand now at 3% unemployment in the city of Billings, And consequently, what that means on the good side is 97% of our graduates get jobs, and usually in the field. But it also means that we've got 18-year-olds coming out of high school that are being paid between $65,000 and $80,000 a year to drive a truck into the oil patch. And so it is difficult to approach those and say, come to school, get a degree in business administration, and 4 years from now start a job at $35,000. So we need, though, to see that as a challenge and not an excuse for our enrollments. And we are looking at that. How do we work around that? How do we work with that? And we're trying to put into place some recruitment plans, putting this advising team together so that we drop the advisors from 450 to 1 to 250 to 1 is another big step on helping us retain these students. To return just a little bit now to the Student Success Committee, that committee is to finish their report by October. And what they're looking at is trying to identify the best practices in retaining students, not just in retaining students, but actually moving them all the way to graduation, whether that's at a 2-year campus or at a 4-year campus. Isolate those best practices and then come up and look at the culture that we've got, the types of programs we've got, the types of students we've got, and implement the ones that are going to help us the best. And this is a place where, being able to come back and ask for a grant of some sort to be able to, some of that money we may leave on the table, say, these are what we really want to do. Lay the plan out for the commissioner, for his office, for the regions. This is how we want to use this money to build these out so that we don't have these same issues moving forward. I think it'll be important for us. We are trying to set some of this funding up internally, but when you're losing enrollment and you're losing budget, it becomes more and more difficult to get ahead of that than when your enrollment is growing. And so we are trying to do that, and you can see some of that in the way we've repositioned our advising center.
Regent Sheehy.
As the Billings Regent, I just want to report that this was really tough on Billings. We have a great deal of ownership in MSUB. We're proud of MSUB. It's a big part of our economy. And I thought this was handled very, very well, Chancellor Nook.
Thank you.
I really did think that as tough as this was, the handling of it through the news cycles, the compressing and giving people enough warning, but at the same time not waiting forever to hear the news, it was handled very well.
Thank you.
I particularly appreciated it.
Thank you. Regent Kraus.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not from Billings, but I think all of us took the news pretty hard, really. This is a proud institution, Montana State University, and whatever priorities or policies we've made that have contributed to this, and you need us to revisit, whatever that might be. You have so many advantages, the state's largest city, all of eastern Montana, I'll say, and their pride in the institution. And I just think all of us have a real stake in your success. And I think, I'll speak for myself, but I want you to know we felt that loss, and that we're dedicated to making the changes that need to be made to help this become not just what it was, but what it could be.
Thank you. One comment on that, just as a follow-up. We've also seen this in the Billings community. The business leaders, community leaders have really rallied around MSUB, and some of the comments that I've heard, especially from the business people, is, it's a 10% reduction. Almost every business person I've talked with has been through a 10% reduction. It's a correction you need to make. You do it. It hurts. It's not easy to move through, but you move through it. And the things that the business community, the community leaders are saying, you're in excellent shape. You're still the third largest institution in our state. You're doing wonderful things for our people downtown. They have realized that not only are 97% of our students getting jobs once they graduate, 50% of them are working in Billings for their first job. So the importance of this institution to Billings and Eastern Montana is very, very clear, and they're behind us. The other thing that's just kind of fun to point out, we recently, the Billings Gazette announced the 40 Under 40. It's a group of 40 individuals who are really making an impact in the community. 20% of those are MSUB alums. So not only are our students moving into the Billings community for their first jobs, they're becoming the community's leaders in business, in healthcare, and in the political world as well. So the city of Billings sees that and understands that we're still an excellent institution. We're facing some difficulties really because of the demographics that are around us, the economy that's around us. And it's just a matter of getting a good handle on that and then moving forward. And as these graduation numbers change at the high school level, I don't see any reason that we won't start to work back. It will be a little bit slow. Those demographics don't return quickly. They don't get back to peak levels for about a decade yet. So we're predicting slow growth. I think the other thing that I'd like to point out, as people ask, will this happen again? In the past, we have done budgeting, tried to estimate our enrollment by assuming that our enrollment next year will be the same as it was this year. And that served the institution well because we were growing. But for the last 4 years, our enrollment has been dropping, and we continued that practice. And it's part of the problem that we're facing and why we're at 10%. We have to do a 10% reduction. And so this year, we had Michael Barber, our IT person, go in and model our enrollment for next year. And we're showing it down. So part of it is we're saying we're going to be down in enrollment next year and use that for our budget. Now, this is the first year we actually have 2 enrollment numbers for next year. We have the number we're using for our budget. We have the number we're asking to come in, right? So admissions has a different number than budget has. And I think that's an essential part of this too.
Thanks. Regent Johnstone.
I'm just curious as to the role of the Commissioner's Office in this. Did you participate in the decisions, and did we look at some of these decisions from a system perspective? Maybe a little bit of a tagline to Jeff's comments.
Mr. Chair, Madam Chair, Regent Johnstone, yes, we very much did, and as did President Cruzado's office, which is the sort of appropriate chain of command there. We participated, we gave feedback. Frankly, we helped make some adjustments to the positions and sort of where we thought the most, the deepest cuts had to come from, those type of decisions we were part of. So I think in this instance, yes, we were very involved in it, and I think Chancellor Nook has done a great job in not only putting together the right group to think about these things, but ultimately rolling out that mission. To your larger question, though, is probably a broader one that we need to work into the budgeting process, which is sort of how does all this fit within the system. And we've talked about this some in other contexts. I think, I feel strongly that we need to make sure we're not trying to do everything in every community. And as we face budget constraints, which I believe we have every day, but they're certainly highlighted by enrollment challenges in this instance, we need to look at those things. And I think that is a broader context. I think there's been some of that. Obviously, the very difficult decision to cut tennis falls into that line. There are other opportunities in the state to participate, ones that frankly, in that example, makes more sense. They're part of the Big Sky Conference. Those are part of the conversations, I think, as we looked at it. And certainly my office, President's office, is involved in those. We had the 3 of us on conference calls as we move forward. And ultimately, I think, got to a spot that serves Billings as best we could and that community as best we can, and does address some system needs. But I think your point is well taken. They always need to come in context and in balance, so that we're trying to do the right thing for those communities, but ultimately the right thing for the system. Certainly part of the process, and will continue to be.
Thank you, Commissioner. Are there any further questions? Or Chancellor Nook, I just want to thank you. This is difficult. You've been in your position for
7 months.
We just want to welcome you and thank you for taking the bull by the horns.
Yep.
The yellow jacket by the whatever.
The stinger, yeah.
Thank you, and thanks for this important conversation.
Thank you very much.
At this point, I would like to move to the consent agenda. Are there any items that the committee or members of the board would like to pull from the consent agenda? Seeing none, we will go ahead and move those to tomorrow's agenda. Okay, moving on to action items. The first action item, authorization to complete research space at third floor interdisciplinary science building at the University of Montana, Missoula. Vice President Mike Reed, would you please come forward?
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Appreciate the opportunity to present this afternoon. As a result of a recent grant received by NASA for $8.2 million, the university is attempting to establish an astrobiology institute. To do so, we are looking at expending $2.3 million in construction on the third floor of the interdisciplinary science building. The $2.3 million construction would be funded by $1.5 million from an intercap loan over 5 years. This intercap loan would be paid by the F&As generated through the grant, and then there's an additional $800,000 that would be funded through private foundations. The $800,000 has not been raised to date, but the construction, which would be a separate component of this project, would not begin until the full $800,000 is received. There's a breakout of the construction expenditures on the attachment number 1, and certainly would be happy to address any questions that you may have.
Any questions for Mr. Reed? Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Moving on to authorization to enter into the lease for Bitterroot College.
Thank you. The University of Montana is requesting authorization to enter into a 5-year lease with Hamilton School District to relocate the Bitterroot College to the Westview School Building. The lease under Addendum 1 would include $500,000 of leasehold improvements to be paid by the university, actually to be reimbursed, to reimburse the school district for the renovation work that they're looking at doing. Presently, the university is leasing approximately 4,300 square feet of space at an annual cost of nearly $88,000, and our enrollment has already exceeded the capacity of that space. The new location will provide approximately almost 13,000 square feet, or more than 3 times the square foot space that we're currently paying for, at a maximum cost of the $500,000 renovations, or in context, roughly $100,000 per year over the 5-year term of the lease. The lease agreement does have in it a option for a first refusal. Should the institution or the school district decide, if the school district decides to sell the property, the university would have a first right of refusal to be able to make a purchase of that property. As of yet, there's no purchase price or an agreement to sell the property, but we are looking at leasing that for the 5-year term. Again, we've exceeded our capacity. The property is located in downtown Hamilton. It's on 15 acres of property as well. The facility is currently occupied by a couple small entities that would remain in the facility, and the rents that they're paying would also revert to the University of Montana during the 5-year period of the term. And I'd be happy to entertain any questions.
Something that I brought up earlier, that this seems like a fantastic opportunity, and it sounds like the superintendent and the school district has been excellent to work with, and it's a great opportunity. As you look at the infusion of funds to improve the property, one thing that I would ask, and certainly would like to ensure that the other regents would concur with this, is that there be some verbiage included that ensures that any sort of improvements made on the property would then be credited back if we do in fact look to purchase the facility down the road.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As we know, the lease currently has no provisions whatsoever with regards to the sale. It simply states that should there be a possibility to purchase the property, it would be negotiated. So the price and the terms of that sale would be negotiated. Ultimately, the price of this facility, we suspect, would end up coming back to this board as well. There's been conversations with the school board. From what I understand, I've not directly been involved with those, along those lines where they've talked about the leasehold improvements and the impact that that would have on the purchase price at that time. And so I think we can certainly ensure that when we negotiate the purchase of the property, if that becomes an actuality in, over the next 5 years, certainly would take that into consideration. And I understand there was a conversation with the superintendent this morning as well, just making sure that they would be willing to take into consideration that $500,000 of renovation work.
Thank you. Regent Johnstone? You sure? Okay. Yes, Regent Robinson.
Madam Chair, I do have a couple questions, if I could. Do you know how old the building is? What year it was built?
Somebody here would. Tori, if I could ask Tori, she's got that answer.
1963, okay. Do you know if I could follow up with another
certainly.
question? If there's been any regular testing for asbestos or lead paint or anything like that?
We know that the building does have all the issues you would expect from a 1963 building. And the school district also, in addition to the $500,000 of renovation work the university would be contributing, the school district also is committed to submit an additional $50,000 as well towards that. And any of the renovations would have to mitigate the asbestos, seal any asbestos or those type of things. So we will encounter that as we do renovations, and that's factored in that cost for the renovation.
Okay, good. Thank you very much for anticipating that.
Sure.
Commissioner Christian.
Madam Chair, my office raised the same questions that you did in terms of the investment that we make now and then potentially having to buy it back later. I think that is a significant challenge with this. But I also think the fact that they're a public school district makes it significantly difficult to bridge that, where a private landowner, I think you could do a lease option, you could probably specify the option value in there. I don't think we can, at least that's the feedback I've gotten, that I'm not sure we can with the school district, because it's going to have a process on its own to get final approval in order for the school district to sell that. And I don't think they can go through all that step now to negotiate a price for the future. So we're, ultimately we can go thumbs up or thumbs down on this at the time of purchase, but I'm not sure we can figure all that out right now.
And I would simply like to just have it at least reflected so that it's a concern that we don't forget about for the future. Chair Tuss?
Yeah, can you tell me what's happening with the current space that is being occupied in the Economic Development Center there, and if there's any ongoing financial obligations for the University of Montana for that current space?
Okay. Madam Chair, Regent Tuss, the space will be vacated. I think our lease goes through the end, or actually the 1st of August. I believe August 1st is the end of our lease with that space, at which point we would vacate and move into this new facility. There is no continuing obligation for the university in that space. Our lease is expired and we're done. As far as future use, I'm not sure what they're doing. I don't know if somebody else may know that, but as far as the university goes, our anticipation is that we're able to enter into this lease, do the renovations, and be able to move in time for the fall semester. Obviously, if the lease is not approved, there has not been another occupant for the space that we're currently in, so we would potentially have to go back and renegotiate for an extended term.
Regent Johnstone.
Well, I guess I thought the economics of the deal where they were leasing it to us for $1, plus we were putting $500,000 into it to have a 5-year lease. So I thought the $500,000 from their standpoint was the lease rental. And so I'd be a little skeptical that they're going to give us much credit on that at the purchase. But I think they'll have to go through a competitive purchase arrangement because they're a public entity. So is that fair analysis?
Sure. Madam Chair, Regent Johnstone, yes, I believe that is the intent of how they originally established this agreement, was that the lease is for $1 and there's $500,000 improvement, which is basically in lieu of the rent. But it's also understood that there could be some concerns with the $500,000 and you know, there's a perception that the university is paying twice for that space, or at least paying additional costs for the space for the renovations or improvements they put into that. So again, I think there's probably two sides to how they want to view that, but I think the way you had stressed it, I think certainly is the position the school district has.
Madam Chair, I concur with that. I mean, I just don't want to set false expectations that we're going to get that offset down the road, because whether it's offset in the rent or, I mean, I don't know how you want to justify it, but I don't think they can make that decision now for the future.
Regent Kraus?
Yeah, I just wanted to say to UM and to Bitterroot College, congratulations on Bitterroot College has experienced significant growth in its student population since 2009, and is one of the two schools that kind of got in the door at right at the last there. I just want to congratulate you on that statement and hope that that continues in the future, and just point out that the more success we have, the more this will be an issue, space will be an issue. So, but congratulations on that.
Thank you, Mike. Are there any further questions? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dean Susan Wolf, would you please come forward to give us information about the authorization for approval of operating agreement between Great Falls College, MSU, and MSU Alumni Foundation, Great Falls College, MSU?
Thank you, Chair Albright and the board. Chris Murray, who's the president of the MSU Alumni Foundation, is also here today. What this agreement is doing is taking us back to what we were doing prior to the previous year. So let me explain. When Great Falls College MSU started their development work, they had one of their own employees doing that work. When he left us, then we didn't hire an individual. We worked with the MSU Alumni Foundation, and they hired an individual who was housed at Great Falls College to do development work for us. When she left and we were getting ready to replace that position, the personnel at MSU Alumni Foundation and at Great Falls College MSU agreed it would be best to have that person be our employee and report directly to me to do that development work. And that's what we agreed upon. And this new agreement, as Chris and I will both say, we took a 9-page document and got it down to 3. Which greatly simplified things. So there really isn't, I think we just went back to the future or back to the past. So yeah, I'll take any questions, please.
Thank you.
Sure.
Regent Johnstone.
Sure, Albrecht. I don't have a question. I just applaud you for doing this, and I think we should encourage more of this happening. I mean, this is an opportunity to share services efficiently. I suspect there are other opportunities, and I hope that we look for them.
Thank you.
Good point. Okay. Could we please have Tracy Ellig come forward to talk to us about the authorization to name the Northern Agricultural Research Center's office building?
Madam Chair, members of the board, thank you. This is a request to rename the office building at the Northern Ag Research Center. Just to give a quick overview to remind the board of the administrative structure, this is one of 7 centers under the Montana Agricultural Experiment Station. The Montana Agricultural Experiment Station is one of the 5 agencies that does research and outreach under the umbrella of the university system. This request is to rename the office building the Greg R. Carlson Agricultural Science Center. Professor Carlson has more than 40 years working in agriculture for the Montana University system. He was a pioneer in many important developments in agricultural on the High Line, including the introduction of GPS in precision agriculture, including helping agricultural producers widely adopt the use of no-till systems, which results in less soil erosion. Just after Thanksgiving of 2010, he suffered a serious accident that left him unable to continue his duties as superintendent at the center, and he has since retired. So this is a renaming in recognition of his very significant contribution to agriculture in the High Line, and it was brought forward by 23 members of the agricultural community who serve on the advisory board for that center, and then it was reviewed by our commemorative tributes committee at MSU, and in both cases it was passed unanimously, and we hope that you receive it favorably today.
Thank you. Chair Tuss.
Madam Chair, I just want to publicly go on record as supporting this and hope that my colleague regents will support this as well. Mr. Greg Carlson is a true public servant to the state of Montana, 40 years with the Northern Ag Research Center. He's a wonderful public servant, and I hope that we can support this strongly. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great opportunity. Well, at this point, I would go ahead and move to adjourn this committee.
I do get the sense in the room that we probably need a short break. Head nods for the short break. Okay, let's make it short. Let's do a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll start the ARSA committee meeting. Thank you. 10 minutes.